dear Professor Thomas POGGE, dear Professor Patrícia Perrone, dear Professor Marcus Faro, dear Professor Cláudio Reis, dear colleagues and students, dear guests. First and foremost, I would like to thank Professor Thomas POGGE for accepting our invitation to deliver this lecture on an award warming project developed for an ecological impact fund. The Professor POGGE, you are very welcome at our faculty. It is a great honor to have you with us today. I would also like to thank Professors Patrícia Perrone, Marcus Faro, and Cláudio Reis for kindly agreeing to join this panel as commentators. My thanks as well to diplomat Dr. Marcus Túlio Scarpelli Cabral, whose support was essential in making this event possible. Dear Professor Maria Cecília de Almeida, thank you for joining us along with the Department of Philosophy. Your presence here is much appreciated. A special word of gratitude goes to Professor Edivaldo Moita, an internationally recognized scholar who, with great generosity, contributed to the organization of this event by handling administrative details that were not his responsibility, graciously compensating for our institutional limitation. Professor Thomas POGGE needs no introduction. He is a renowned political philosopher, widely published in areas of justice theory, human rights, environmental issues, and poverty. Today, he will present the lecture, Climate Justice, an Ecological Impact Fund. This talk is linked to the project for which he was awarded the Innovation Policy Prize by the Office of Health Economics, OHE. Dear audience, please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Thomas POGGE. Dear Thomas, if I may, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will follow the example of speaking without a microphone because, as you saw, it isn't working so well. Okay, so this lecture is dedicated to the memory of Sebastião Salgado, and I am not a new fan of his. As you can see on the next slide, no fewer than 4 of my books have pictures of Sebastião Salgado on the cover. Hope you can see that. And I've been a great fan of his work, both as regards to the poor and marginalized populations and also in regard to the beautiful nature of our planet that this lecture here will try to preserve. Now, I don't have to tell you about the problems that we are facing. We have a climate emergency with accelerating warming of the planet Earth, threatening to get a lot worse than it is. This is the 30th COP that you are now presiding over. 30 years these people have been talking and collecting per diems and frequent flyer miles, but very little has been achieved. The CO2 content and greenhouse gas emissions have been rising in the atmosphere and rising actually at an accelerating rate. So the increase has itself increased. So we get a curve like this. And it is finally time, I think, to do something tangible. And one idea for doing something tangible that we could launch this year under Brazil's presidency is what I want to introduce to you today. So the problem is well known. Climate change threatens our planet, sea level rise, unbearable heat, spread of tropical diseases, lack of food and water, so-called natural disasters becoming more and more frequent and more severe, and the loss of biodiversity. There's another problem related that is less talked about, but more severe right now, and that is the problem of the immediate effects, health effects of pollution. So according to this study here, 8.7 million people die annually from the effects of air pollution. They die, of course, from heart attacks and strokes and respiratory problems, but the number would be much lower if these problems were not brought on by air pollution. 8.7 million, that is about 1/7 of all deaths every day, week, and year. And so it's a very, very severe problem concentrated in the global south, in particular in the heavily populated urban areas such as Sao Paulo, New Delhi, Cairo, and Dhaka. Now, we could go back to a pre-industrial era, but we don't really want to do that. We want not only those who now enjoy the conveniences of modern life to keep those conveniences, but we also want these conveniences to spread. We want the same kind of safe and comfortable life that people in the global north enjoy to be enjoyed by everybody on this planet. And so the solution is really green technologies. We need washing machines, we need running water, we need electricity and so on, but we need to produce it in ways that do not burden our environment. This is all very trivial. The question is, how do we make this happen? How do we get these green technologies? How do we get the innovation? And also, very importantly, how do we make them spread? How do we improve the uptake of these green technologies so that people are actually using them? Across the whole economy, consumption, steel production, cement production, electricity production, we need to greenify, so to speak, the way we operate. Now, the present system that we have incentivizes innovations, in particular green innovations, through patents. A patent is basically a 20-year privilege that innovators can claim in every country that is a member of the WTO, the World Trade Organization. A 20-year privilege to be the sole seller of that particular innovation. Anybody who wants to produce it or market it must buy your permission in the form of paying royalties or licensing fees. Now, this system produces somewhere around 30,000 distinct green innovations every year, and that's a good thing. Obviously, the system works in producing innovations, but the same system also has a big obvious drawback. It impedes the distribution of these innovations. The very same monopoly markups that incentivize innovators to innovate also disincentivize potential buyers from buying the innovation and using the innovation. So the patent system is good for incentivizing innovation. It's bad for making these innovations spread. In the global north, this is to some extent compensated by regulations that simply forbid the use of certain dirty technologies, and also by special incentives that move people from dirty to green technologies. For example, you put a price on carbon, you penalize people for emitting carbon, And that way you make the use of green technologies, relatively speaking, cheaper and move people over to green technologies. Now, this sort of method is not widespread in the global south. And for one thing, the global south doesn't want to hamper its own economic development by imposing these impediments. And also, I think very significantly, the global south doesn't want to produce a large financial outflow to the global north. So where do these innovations come from? Who is innovating? Well, these are the countries in the global north who have a big advantage in financial and human capital, and they dominate the innovation frontier. Innovation is expensive, the easy pickings have already been made, and so it is European companies, Japanese companies, American companies, Chinese companies that dominate the innovation race. And so people in the global south understandably say, you're kidding, you want us to pay money for the right to use an innovation that you have invented in the global north so that we can help clean up a mess that you made. You produced this big mess. And so why the hell should we pay you money for the privilege of helping to clean it up? So that's another very important reason, I think, for why the South is more reluctant to put a price on carbon and to create these green incentives. So here's a concrete example, just one among many. This is a company, Matsui Babcock, in Japan, that is the patent owner on a technology for producing energy from coal in a highly efficient way. It's called ultra supercritical. So in order to use this ultra supercritical technology, the Matsui Babcock is charging $1.5 million per 600 megawatt boiler. The Chinese paid that money. Harbin Electric, for example, said, okay, we're using that technology and we will pay you. In India, the power producing companies said, no, thank you. We have a lot of coal. We are just going to use the old technology, subcritical or supercritical, and we will just blow 30% more pollution into the atmosphere. Now, that is obviously, from a global point of view, is insane, right? We have a wonderful new technology that reduces the ecological impact of power production from coal, but we are not using it because of these high patent fees. Matsui Babcock doesn't get a penny out of India. It doesn't benefit them, but the planet is suffering the effects. Now, how can we do things differently? Here's the proposal. The proposal is to create an ecological impact fund, as I call it. And the ecological impact fund would every year disperse a large amount of money, let's say $4 billion to fix ideas. And these $4 billion would be used to reward green innovators who are willing to forego their patent privileges in the global south. So the ecological impact fund says to you, the innovator, if you're willing to waive your patent privileges in the lower income countries, we will give you a slice of that money. You get a share of this reward money. Now, how big a slice do you get? Well, that depends on the impact of your innovation, the impact of the use of your innovation also in the same global south countries. Impact is measured by two criteria. On the one hand, reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, so impact on climate change and global warming. Secondly, health impact, impact on the global burden of disease. Remember the example that I gave earlier about air pollution. So you get paid on a metric that takes account of those two things. Now, the way it would work is quite simple. All the innovations that are registered, remember it's a voluntary system, you don't have to participate, but you can. All the green innovations that participate are assessed in terms of their impact on these two dimensions. And the $4 billion is divided in proportion to the impact. If your innovation accounts for 1% of the total impact in the global south that all the registered innovations have achieved, you get 1% of the money. As simple as that. So it's a competitive system in which everybody who enters gets some money, but of course some people will get a high return on their investment and other people perhaps a low return on their investment. So the deal here is what this is supposed to do is twofold. First, it is going to massively increase the spread of green technologies in the global south. That happens for two reasons. One is we take away the headwind of patent markups. So we lower the price of green technologies because there's no longer a monopoly rent component included in the price. And the second thing we do is we add a tailwind, a wind from behind, a positive force that is the impact reward. So now the innovator not only gets the sales price from the sale of its innovation, but also in addition gets the impact reward. It can be lucrative to sell a green technology for zero if you get enough impact reward for the use of that technology and for the benefit that it has by reducing greenhouse gases and pollution. So that's the one thing that the EIF does. But the EIF does, the Ecological Impact Fund does a second thing as well, and that is it inspires the development of innovations that otherwise would never have been developed. So poor countries have poor populations. And if you are an innovator and you think, what might very poor people need? What might they really want? What would really be important for them? You will find that, well, even if I can invent such a thing, I can't make a whole lot of money with it, right? I can make a lot of money with Gucci handbags. I produce them cheaply and I sell them at a very high price. But try doing that with things that poor people need. You won't have many customers. They can't afford a high price. So whole areas of innovation are not really pursued by innovators because there's not much money in it. And the Ecological Impact Fund would change that, in particular in regard to two types of innovations. One, innovations that are catering to poor people, people in the tropics in particular. And secondly, also innovations where the benefit of using the innovation goes overwhelmingly to third parties, right? So and this is true for virtually all green technologies. Typically with innovations, people buy the innovation because it's beneficial. You buy a fantastic smartphone because that makes your life much better. But if you buy a green technology like an electric car, 99.99999% of the benefit goes elsewhere. It doesn't go to you, it doesn't go to your family, it doesn't go to your friends and neighbors, it goes to the whole planet, all life on Earth, future generations. And so few people are so altruistic that they pay a lot of attention to that. They judge innovations mainly by the benefits they themselves get out of it. So certain classes of innovation would be much accelerated and would enter a trajectory of much faster innovation growth. And that, again, would be highly beneficial for the purpose that we want to pursue here, which is to do something tangible and real in regard to climate change and pollution. So again, the way it would work is we distribute each year that pool of money. The registered innovators are paid for 5 years. So they enter the distribution system the moment their innovation reaches the market in the global south. and they exit 5 years later. For 5 years, they participate in the payouts. At the end of 5 years, they have had their reward, and the innovation becomes available to anyone. It just becomes just like an expired patent. The innovation can be used for free by everyone. Is this politically realistic? So I think it is a politically realistic idea. For one thing, it is optional, right? No innovator is ever forced to participate in the system. If you want to insist on your patent rights, you can. It is a voluntary scheme. It's voluntary also for the funders. There is a country that is a little north of here that will not participate in the system, at least not under its current president. And that's perfectly fine. The rest of us can organize the system without him and without them. And again, that's important. We don't need to wait for universal consensus. Moreover, in Azerbaijan at the COP29 recently, the rich countries promised that they would increase global climate financing from the current 100 billion a year to 300 billion a year by 2035. And what we want is simply not new money, but just a slice of this money. I was recently in Bonn, Germany, and I participated, but I didn't participate exactly. I was an admitted observer at the meeting of the UNFCCC Standing Committee on Climate Finance. And that committee tracks all the money that rich countries give for climate finance. And they basically decide about every expenditure. Does it really count as climate finance or does it not? Is it really climate related or is it not? And very shyly, I asked them and I said, what about effectiveness? Does it matter whether this climate, it's related to climate, all right, but does it matter whether it does just a tiny little bit or does a lot? No, they said, that's not part of our mandate. That is not our mission. We have nothing to do with that. So these people count any money that is spent somehow on climate as climate financing without regard to effectiveness. Now, what do you think is the result of that? The result of that is that so long as it counts, so-called donor countries will spend the money in a way that serves other political purposes that they also have. For example, the German government wants to please Siemens, which is a big German technology company. And so obviously they will say, why don't we spend some climate financing in a way that benefits Siemens, right? The last thing the Germans would ever do is spend it on a very efficient technology that belongs to the Chinese. The Chinese, right? Can't give any money to them. So the thing then is, if efficiency is not part of the parameters, it's not measured, it's not accounted for, nobody cares about it, then you can expect decision makers not to be particularly efficient with the money. There are other problems. For example, 3/4 of that money is loans. And many developing countries, especially in Africa, are heavily indebted. And so, of course, their debt problems become worse with these loans. It's not even a gift. 93% of the money is also counted as development assistance. So you pay, this is the next slide. Yeah, this is what I need, good. So you counted doubly, and so $116 billion is spent on global climate finance, 211 is spent on development assistance, and the sum total of those two amounts is a measly 219 billion because of the overlap. Of course, countries do that, right? Why wouldn't they if this is the way it's counted? So what I'm pleading for is let's spend $4 billion in an honest way and in an effective way. At least that much should be conceded by the richer countries that pay the climate finance. How would this work? Well, we need states to get it going. This fund, unlike other funds, has a specific problem. The problem is that much of its benefit comes through incentives, right? It incentivizes innovation. And these incentives work only if the money is secure. So if you start innovating now, you hope you will have a great innovation in 2027, and then you want to be paid for the next 5 years, 2032. So you will not even get off the sofa if you are not pretty sure that there will be money for you in 2032. That kind of a guarantee or assurance can only come from states initially. But in the long term, we can add financing from individual donations, from foundations, from offset markets where companies are buying emission certificates for compensating their own emissions. And ultimately we could, like Yale University, build up an endowment that would cushion potential ups and downs of the economy and could also be a source of dividend and interest income that would eventually cover more and more of the annual reward distribution. Ideally, in the long run, a few decades down the road, the fund could be completely autonomous, independent, it could have its own endowment, and be a machine that produces accelerated green innovation growth in perpetuity. I want to conclude by highlighting 8 design features of the EIF that make the EIF brutally efficient, vastly more efficient than anything that you could easily think up, I think. But if you think up something better, I will support your idea and not mine. So, because efficiency is what matters. So the first thing is we focus on lower income countries. The whole system works only in the lower income countries because that is where the lowest hanging fruits are yet to be harvested. In the rich countries, we are already, at least in the nice rich countries, not in the US, we are already doing a lot. We are changing all the window panes to make them more insulating and so on and so forth. Very expensive ways of reducing emissions. In the global south, very cheap and easy innovations are still not effective, and we could do very much better. As you can see on the next chart, the biggest increase in emissions is to be expected from the lower middle and lower income countries that are growing rapidly. I make a very simple thought experiment. In 2100, Africa will have 4 billion people. That is 12 times as many people as the US has now. It's not unrealistic to assume that they will have a standard of living comparable to the US today in 75 years. If they do, and if they use the technologies that the US is now using, they will pollute 12 times as much as the US is now polluting. You can kiss this planet goodbye if that happens. So that's where we have to intervene early, and bring the African continent and the global south generally onto a green trajectory. Right? Leapfrogging is one word that comes to mind in that context. So we can do, with this money, we can do vastly, vastly more than all the green innovations and green little measures that are taken in the richer countries. The second thing is that the EIF pays for success. So there is a distinction that is often made between push funding and pull funding, or funding ex ante and funding ex post. I'm an academic, so much of the funding that I'm familiar with is push funding. So they say, who is interested in doing some work on XYZ problem? I raise my hand, I say, look, I'm at Yale University, give me the money, and so on. And so people give the money to good-looking folks, people who look good on paper, but often it doesn't pan out. And so a huge amount of that money gets wasted. The Ecological Impact Fund never wastes a penny. It simply pays for success. If you have more success, you get more money. If you have no success, you get no money. It's as simple as that. Now, success, and that's the next point, is defined in terms of complete implementation. Another sort of ex post or pull funding is prizes. I just won this £20,000 prize for this very idea in Great Britain. But this prize I got for a prototype. I wrote a paper and said, this is a great idea, look at it. And they gave me money for that. But did I have any kind of real success? Not yet, not really. The world is no bit better off just because I wrote the silly paper. So what the EIF does, it pays for real success, it pays for the end result, for real emission reductions and health improvements in the real world. So in order to get any money, it's not enough that you deliver a prototype of some wonderful innovation. What you must do is you must go into the global south and get your innovation uptaken and installed. You have to make sure it actually works and works efficiently. You have to make sure it gets maintained and repaired and runs properly. And then, in proportion to the real impact, you get paid. That means you have to think already when you start to innovate about the entire pipeline from the very beginning, where you conceive an idea, to the very end, where end users are buying your product in droves and are using it correctly and effectively. And so you're trained basically by the EIF to think holistically about innovation and its uptake. Another thing that makes the EIF super efficient is that it uses a very open innovation space. That again is very unusual, right? Typically, prizes, for example, they tell you exactly what to innovate. We need a malaria vaccine. It has to have at least 75% effectiveness. It has to cost less than 35 cents a dose. It has to be, and so on. You get a wish list, and sometimes it's a dead end. Sometimes what they want is not even doable. And sometimes you get a lot of duplication. A lot of different people jump through the same hoops, repeat the same things, just in order to get the prize. The EIF doesn't follow that pattern. The EIF says, we don't care at all what you innovate. It could be something very small, it could be something very big, it could be a new animal feed, it could be a new way of making cement, it could be a new gadget in regulating the power supply. You, innovators, you know your capacities, you know the field in which you are working, you decide how you want to improve our planet, and we simply look at the result, measure it on a very general scale, and then pay you in proportion to the impact that you achieve. Again, that is efficient because innovators are better able than prize givers to think about where these innovators can make the most effective progress. And also there's no duplication because different innovators can explore very different corners of the innovation space. Fifth point is we have a dynamic competition. The EIF generates a kind of artificial market that is keeping the reward rate at an efficient level. The reward rate is endogenous to the system. So if you ask me how much money do I get for each ton of CO2 averted or for each year of human life extended, I can't tell you in advance. We don't know this. It depends on demand and supply of innovation. So the rate of reward is always going to be at an efficient level. If at some point innovators find it unsatisfactory, they will stop registering innovations and the reward rate will recover because fewer and fewer innovations will share the money. If at any point the reward rate becomes super attractive, new innovations will be registered and the reward rate will go down. So innovators are assured that the reward rate will always be satisfactory, and funders are assured that the reward rate will never produce windfall profits for innovators. That, again, makes the fund more efficient. Sixth, the fund strengthens neglected markets. It attracts investment toward high-impact innovations that were neglected because their potential users are poor or because their buyers can expect only a small fraction of the benefit of using it. And here it is the impact rewards that make sales profitable, even sales way below cost, because the impact reward can make it profitable for the innovator to sell way below cost. So for the first time, we will have a significant flow of innovation specifically catered to people who are poor, living in tropical areas, in remote areas, and so on. And that, again, because this hasn't been done before, we can expect to harvest very low-hanging fruits. Of course, the EIF would provide incentives for wide adoption. So if I'm an innovator on the EIF, I want my innovation to be very widely used, and I will take all measures to make sure that it is widely used. I will say, look, you can have it cheaper. I will help you install it. I will help you maintain it and repair it as needed, because every time your machine is down, I lose money because I get paid for the ecological impact of the machine that you are running. So again, the incentives are here perfectly aligned. The eighth and final point is one about exponential progress. I did tell you that you get paid as innovator, you get paid for the ecological impact, but I want to make that a little more precise. The ecological impact is a difference between two things, namely the emissions and health burdens that are produced with your innovation in the world compared to what would have been produced if your innovation had never reached the market. So we have a baseline here. The baseline is the state of the art at the moment your innovation comes out. Right now, people in Africa are using open fires to cook. Now your stove gets introduced, and we are comparing the health burdens on women cooking with the old system and the new system. Now the Ecological Impact Fund, imagine it to have been in existence for 25 years. So we are now in the year 2050, and new innovations come onto the market. They get compared to the state of the art in 2050. But the state of the art in 2050 is much superior to what the state of the art in 2050 would have been if the Ecological Impact Fund hadn't existed in the 25 years between now and then. And that means the Ecological Impact Fund is even more super efficient because it pays only for the increment, for the improvement over the 2050 state of the art that a new innovation coming online in that year achieves. And it doesn't have to pay for all the improvement in the baseline that preceded 2050. So again, that is another way of saying that the EIF greatly accelerates green progress and thereby is exponential in its impact. So to this, one could add one more point that speaks to efficiency, and that is that the patent system is very inefficient. The patent system, as economists have pointed out since Adam Smith, is a system that is very costly. You pay a lot of money to patent everywhere in the world. You have to patent in all the different jurisdictions. You have to observe in all these jurisdictions, is anybody infringing my patent? If they are infringing your patent, you have to send the lawyers after them and litigate. All of that is very expensive. Also, additional expenses come from the big gap between the cost and the price. That big gap produces what economists call deadweight losses, many foregone transactions between the cost price and the actual price. which would be beneficial to both the buyer and the seller, but do not come about. And they also cause excessive advertising because of the high profit margin. People will pull out all the stops and try to sell extra copies because it's so lucrative to do that. But this will be done not only by the company, but also by the competitor. Often they pay kickbacks to potential intermediaries to sell my product rather than some competitor's product. All of that is inefficient, as are efforts at evergreening patents. That's another thing, that innovators spend enormous amounts of money trying to extend their patents beyond the 20 years that the primary patent gets. So that's another benefit. The final benefit is capacity building, that with this ecological impact fund, we would create capacity and employment in the global south. People would operate, deploy, distribute, repair, maintain these innovations in the global south. And also, people in the global south would have a much better chance competing in the innovation race than they do with the technologies that are already at a very advanced level. Right? If you wanted to create, let's say, a better windmill as an African innovator, good luck to you. Billions and billions have been spent by northern innovators on perfecting windmills. If you want to invent a better cooking stove for poor people in the global south, you might very well do better than northern innovators because you know the problems, you know the people you're catering to, and so a greater share of the innovation profits that the EIF distributes would likely end up in the global south than is the case now with all the patent revenue, which overwhelmingly goes to the global north. So in conclusion, addressing you as Brazilians, in conclusion, what I hope is that in these times where we are lucky to have Brazil leading the COP, where we are lucky to have South Africa leading the G20, where we were lucky to have Donald Trump uniting sane people against him, that in this very special year, we can do something that goes beyond the usual declarations where we say, yes, we have agreed to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees. We have agreed to make the world better, to reduce poverty, blah, blah, blah. Filing cabinets could be filled with all these summit declarations and policy papers. Let's do something real for once, something that really makes a measurable difference to ecological problems and to the quality of life of poor people in the world, and let Brazil be in the forefront of that effort. Thank you.
Dear Professor Pogge, thank you for this your thought-provoking lecture. Now I will invite the commentator to come. We will begin our discussion. Yes, each commentator has 5 minutes. I'd like to hand over to Professor Patrícia Perrone for her remarks.
Okay, so
Patrícia, the floor is yours.
okay, thank you very much. It's a joy to be here at the University of Brasilia. I thank Professor Marcelo Neves for the invitation, and I think that we have a great opportunity to discuss a very concrete proposal that could help us advance on on combating climate changes. So I would like to highlight a few characteristics of the fund that Professor Pogge is proposing. First of all, this fund proposes that we rethink climate global justice. It is based on a principle that says, well, the ones who polluted more should be more responsible for financing the solutions and the pollution. Actually, we know that rich countries could advance and develop partially because of technologies that are not green. We know that poor countries are not able to do this anymore because now legislation is much more restrictive. We also know that the countries offering the green technologies nowadays are the same that polluted before. And so if the poor countries cannot develop in one side and on the other side have to have all the costs in acquiring these new technologies, it's a double loss for them. They cannot develop in the same way because they cannot use the same technologies in one side. They have to pay for depolluting technologies produced by the North on the other side. So first of all, the fund seeks to correct historical distortions concerning the pollution that generated our climate problem. Second, it is concerned with democratizing the access to clean and new technologies. It has the concern of creating an instrument that enables poor countries to have access to the same great technologies of the rich countries without the same sacrifice of resources. And third, what calls attention, remuneration for the patents and the new technologies is proportional to its effectiveness, what is quite important since it guarantees that the more the technology is improving the pollution, the more are the gains. And on the other hand, if the technology is not effective, it's not efficient, its innovator is not receiving or is receiving proportionally to the capacity of the technology. Therefore, I believe that this proposal presents three main advantages: promoting global climate justice among North and Global South countries, combating exclusion from access to relevant technologies from poor countries, and rewarding the most effective technologies. Again, as it was the call of Professor POGGE, this is a way of putting aside a rhetorical and too much speech on combating climate change and going to practice and trying to propose something concrete that could really help us improve combating climate change. I think this is also a very good opportunity to Brazil for leading this changes, and it considers our structural inequalities. The proposal is quite in harmony with all the other previous work of Professor POGGE. He's a scholar from the North, but very concerned with Global South. He has been writing on poverty, on hunger, on combating hunger, on promoting access to health at the Global South. So this is just one more try to improve conditions at the Global South and see the problems from our perspective, although he comes from the North. So it's a very nice opportunity to be here. And if I could ask a question, it would be how real and how much could we expect from these rich countries in terms of endowment? What would be the incentives for them to really adhere to this proposal of the fund.
Yes, thank you for your clarifying comments, Patrícia. I now invite Professor Cláudio Reis to speak. Cláudio, the floor is yours.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank Professor Marcelo, Professor Divaldo, and my colleague Maria Cecilia for the invitation and the opportunity to be here. It was a pleasure to hear Professor POGGE exposing his proposal. I didn't prepare a commentary, a proper commentary, not least because I'm not very well acquainted with this discussion and the many questions it raises. So instead, I will try to raise two questions that occurred to me reading the proposal that has been awarded last year. The first question is, in fact, more of a curiosity question, I would say, a question from someone who is not quite familiar with this question, this aspect of measurement, this notion of impact measurement. And the question is the following. To say that an innovation X has the impact Y is to say that this innovation, this green innovation, caused this effect, which is impact. So to measure the impact, first we should be able to identify this relation between this innovation and this effect, this impact. My question is a real doubt and a real curiosity. The question is that possible? Is it possible to say that this innovation caused that impact, that effect? Because I think from the perspective of the innovator, the relation, let's say, between my innovation, my technology, and the patent is as a clear relation. It's atomistic, let's say, so to speak. This patent belongs to this innovation. No question about that. But the relation between one innovation and the impact is more, so to speak, I said atomistic, let's say, so to speak, holistic. Is it possible to identify that, especially in a context, in a situation where you could have dozens, hundreds, thousands, maybe, innovations interacting? So some innovations are competing among them, others are reinforcing one another, etc. So I think if I am an innovator, if I have a patent, I would be worried if my innovation is being fairly measured. The impact of my innovation is fairly measured, to the point that I am willing to waive my property right. I don't know if there is some discussion about that, but that's a question that stayed with me reading the proposal. So that's the first question. I hope I made it more or less clear. The second question is a little more speculative, perhaps. I don't know. But the text of the proposal says that this initiative is, and I quote here, based on the idea that the protections and conveniences of modern life, which have produced immense pollution problems, should be preserved in altered form, and I think this proviso is important, in altered form, and even be extended to that majority of human beings who are still largely excluded from them, which is good enough. It's a good premise. The proposal also says, and Professor POGGE repeated that in his talk, the following, and I quote again: if the 4 billion Africans projected for the end of 21st century were to live like the residents of the United States do now, they would produce 12 times as much pollution. So now I would say those Africans won't be able to live as nowadays North Americans live. And I would add, not even the North Americans at the end of the century. They won't be able to live like they live today. Much less like their parents and grandparents from the 20th century. The question is, shouldn't we rethink maybe this premise? I understand that this initiative intends to do a part, intends to be a part of a larger effort. Yes, I see that. It is clear in the proposal, so it's only a part of a bigger, a larger effort. But we should be able to evaluate what is this part? Which part is the initiative really playing in these efforts? Is it really possible to maintain this promise? Or, in other words, this alteration of form to take the expression from the proposal. This alteration of form is maybe much more must be much more radical than the proposal maybe assume as a premise here. Those are the two questions that occur to me reading the proposal. For the rest, I think I agree fundamentally with the orientation and the values that are behind the initiative, as Patrícia said here. Well, if Professor POGGE has some ideas to share with us about these points, I think it would be good.
Thank you for your insightful comments, Cláudio. Now over to Professor Marcus Faro for his commentary. Marcus, dear friend Marcus, the floor is all yours.
Okay. Well, thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'd like first to thank Professor Marcelo and Professor Edvaldo for the invitation and to participate in this interesting gathering with the distinguished Professor Thomas POGGE. Early in his career, Professor POGGE engaged in the study of Immanuel Kant, surprisingly perhaps to some, and ended up becoming a very active participant in discussions on topics that have attracted global attention, such as world poverty, human rights, global health, and illicit financial flows. The trajectory of Professor POGGE may suggest to some of his readers that in his own way he took to task what he encountered in some of Kant's writings. Of course, this is my interpretation, right? And perhaps he has specifically considered the contrast established by Kant between dignity and price, which we can compare to the contrast often made between justice and market outcomes. In my view, reconciling market outcomes with justice remains a paramount task to those of us who strive to reform markets so they can be reconciled with justice. This, by the way, has been the guidepost of work I developed here with a group of students at the university, at the Faculty of Law. Most recently, Professor POGGE seems to be spearheading the effort that he's exposed here, in which he came up with ideas that may contribute to the establishment of new ways in which climate change is being currently confronted by global actors. And Professor, I had access to two pieces of writing by Professor POGGE, an article, research article entitled An Ecological Impact Fund, and the other is a submission to the Office of Health Economics in London, for which he received from this organization the Innovation Policy Prize of 2024. Both texts are closely related. So in the next few minutes, I will try to present to you some brief remarks I dared to produce on Professor POGGE's instigating article and submission. I think it is a welcome feature of Professor POGGE's recent work that he takes on a very challenging problem with many inherent political and economic difficulties on a global scale. The problem he confronts is how to effectively fight climate change and its often devastating impacts, in many cases including human health, transportation, food production, etc., as he has indicated here in his presentation. And I think very positive that in confronting the many-sided and daunting problems I have outlined, you, Professor, look for a solution that is market-based, but a different kind of market, I would say. And that does not depend on a set of principles that would rely on some kind of coercive regulation imposed by those who wield power. The intellectual and practical hurdles you face have to do with how to set up market rules that are feasible, helpful, and hold a good chance of inviting enough consent as to become politically and socially legitimate. Painted in broad strokes, one important path to effectively confront the problem of climate change, according to your ideas, as I understood them, of course, is to create a new regime of intellectual property, alternative to that of the WTO. And your project would also have crucial differences when compared to the so-called international offset markets. One of the main ideas of this new international regime that is proposed is that it would be welded to a credit policy managed by a global fund, the EIF. This fund would provide economic incentives to the production of technological innovations that are friendly to the environment, including, of course, ones that would help curb harmful greenhouse gas emissions. And these technological innovations have received, I don't know if you coined the term of greennovation or someone else, but it's very appealing. And in your blueprint for the EIF, new intellectual property rules would be regional, as I understood them, would be regional, in the sense that they would apply to processes and transactions occurring within a geographical zone, or perhaps in more than one zone, that's my guess. Each one comprising special purpose jurisdiction belonging primarily to the global south, that is, lower income countries. Apparently, key features of the new IP regime, intellectual property regime, would include rules under which, having registered a new environmentally sound technology, green innovation originators would first wait for a set of period. You mentioned 5-6 years, but I think you also have in mind different periods. Would waive for a set of period any monopoly rights that would originate from the new technology within the relevant jurisdiction. Second, originators would receive financial rewards commensurate to the value of emissions and other harms averted by the use of the new technology in the economic process for the same duration of the deployment of the new technology within the relevant jurisdiction. The measurements of the averted harms would include verifiable impacts on global warming, biodiversity loss, global disease spread, and of course one can think of the pandemics of COVID recently, right? In other words, several, according to your quote-unquote policy model, as I understand it, several new markets for intellectual property would be created and would operate in some geographical areas comprising countries and or, this is my addition, subnational regions or perhaps specific biomes or river basins, for example, in the Global South under the authority of the Special Purpose Fund, that is the EIF, that would manage a credit facility dedicated to financing renovation projects found to be technically suitable to receive what I call modified patent grants. These would be subject by regulation to mandatory waivers, as I said, of patent proceeds for a set of periods, etc., etc. Right? Supposedly, such markets would help Global South countries, which are still very rich, like Brazil, very rich in renewable and non-renewable natural resources, to impart momentum to clean development in the Global South itself, but also in the Global North by virtue of what I would call the trickle-up effect and not the trickle-down, right? Well, in conclusion, I would say that all of what I've mentioned in my very brief summary, and perhaps not so precise as Professor wished it to be, so all of what I've mentioned in this summary is definitely antithetical to what current international offset markets are about. Having followed some ideas of Ronald Coase, perhaps many of you are familiar with this author, offset markets inescapably reward those who harm the environment by legally morphing mischiefs into property rights. Mischiefs are morphed into property rights that can be bought and sold at a monetary price. Cap and trade markets are, in my view, a very bad idea. Let us recall that Ronald Coase's ideas were the fountainhead of the much maligned Chicago-style economic analysis, but that is dear to the heart of some of our high-level judges in Brazil. Thus, we may say that the train of thought emanating from Coase remains quite detrimental to the health of our planet and does not contribute to foster clean development. Market outcomes that rely on rewarding evildoers are not reconcilable with any conception of justice on a planetary scale. By contrast, the ideas put forward by Professor POGGE in his article and prized submission are a boon to whomever is canvassing the current global policy scenario in search of a way forward in the process of bringing to fruition the Kantian goal of reconciling market outcomes and ideals of justice before it is too late. Thank you.
Thank you for your thoughtful words, Marcus. Now I hand it back to Professor Thomas POGGE for his remarks. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Okay, I will try to be brief because we also want to maybe hear from the audience. But thank you, first of all, for these very good and helpful comments. Patricia, you asked the question, how much can we expect from the rich countries in particular? And the thing there is, how much can we coax out of the rich countries is how I would reformulate that question. Right? On the left to their own devices, they're not going to support this. What we have to do is we have to incentivize them, motivate them, and put a little pressure on them. And that pressure can come from two main directions. One is from below, from the citizens of the country. They can say, I want my government to do this. And the other pressure comes from peers. So that's why I mentioned Trump, where countries might say, look, if other countries seem willing to engage in something like that, then I don't want to not play my part. I want to be part of this coalition. And here I feel a little bit, this is like matchmaking among teenagers, right? You want to somehow indicate to both sides that the other side is interested and get them, sort of get the shyness out of the system. And so I want the Europeans to think that the Chinese would be quite happy with a system like this and that they would make a contribution to it. And conversely, I want the Chinese to have some sense that the Europeans might be interested in it, maybe the Canadians and so on. And in this way, we can get to 100%, I think. 100%, by this I mean, if the Chinese were willing to, let's say, bear a third of the cost of the EIF, $1.3 billion a year, which is for them, a very small amount, then maybe the Germans would say, oh, we are willing to pay 10%, and then the French would say, we will also pay 10%, and so on. So could we get to something with a reciprocity, a kind of project? If we get to 85%, then we can maybe say to the ones that have pledged, let's all add, let's say, another 10% to each of our pledges to get close to 100% and so on. So I'm not sitting here expecting, I am trying to build this up. I've just given an interview in China in April, which has apparently 2.5 million viewers. So I hope that in China there's a bit of a support swell. And I definitely know that the Chinese are feeling unhappy with the fact that they're often characterized as aggressive and as exploitative on the African continent and so on and so forth. And I think they would like to participate in a project that is clearly morally motivated and is multilateral and is in opposition to the every state for itself mentality that comes out of Washington and a few other countries. So I would say it's doable, but not without a lot of hard work and not without a lot of support from everybody in this room and many people beyond this room. So that won't happen by itself, for sure. Now, the questions Cláudio raised, there is the question measurement, cause, effect. I mean, the puzzles that you raised concern multiplicity of innovations. So you have sometimes competing innovations, you have innovations that are collaborating with each other. The competing case, I don't think, is very hard. So if you have two innovations coming onto the market at roughly the same time or have overlapping reward periods, then if they are, let's say they are more or less simultaneous in their appearance, that they're both registered with the Ecological Impact Fund, you would simply measure them both against the same baseline and see how much each of them achieves. So they do more or less the same thing. And some people prefer to use the one innovation, other people prefer to use the other. And you would simply measure how much each of them does. If one has a market share of 20% and the other has a market share of 60%, then you look at the efficiency, multiply out the numbers and the average use. I don't think that's very problematic. What is more problematic is situations where you need several patents or several innovative ideas in order to create one product. And what happens in those cases is that the people who are creating that product, right, somebody has to organize it. It could be presumably one of the innovators involved would say, look, my innovation is pretty cool, yours is pretty cool, but they don't work singly. We need to bring them together somehow. So they will simply make a contract. And whatever contract they make, the EIF will honor. So they make a contract and say, we split the EIF reward 50-50, or we split the EIF reward 60-40, or whatever it is. And the EIF will simply pay money to the team and the team will then decide how to divide that money. So, and if one of the innovations is EIF registered and the other isn't, then of course the one that is EIF registered would need to negotiate with the patent holder and would need to buy that license or whatever to operate. That would, of course, be a little non-ideal in that the price might be higher. But again, that is something that the EIF would have to think about, whether they would want to put a ceiling on the price. The other question that you raised, I wasn't 100% sure that I understood it, but one sentence that stuck out was when you said maybe we need something more radical. This is a part of the solution, and that is very true. You know, I am, first of all, definitely delivering part of the solution, and I'm also delivering a non-ideal solution in the sense that I'm not, like philosophers are often ridiculed as doing, I'm not saying wipe the blackboard clean and let's start over. I'm saying let's take TRIPS for granted. I hate TRIPS. I don't think TRIPS is a very bad idea. But it's there, and we are not going to get rid of it. Realistically, we are not going to get rid of it. The interests supporting it are extremely powerful, and so what we need to do is we have to work around it somehow. We have to do something that works with TRIPS and despite TRIPS, and the way I see it is we buy out the people who are entitled to the patents by offering something that they prefer, in other words, more money. Those who expect to earn more on the EIF than on the patent track will register their innovations, and that will deliver a partial solution, a lower path of emissions than would otherwise have prevailed. And if I'm right, then significantly lower. On your points, the dignity prize, I was very grateful for that thing, and I've written a good bit about how Rawls is not really a real Kantian, he's far too consequentialist and so on, so I'm a great Kantian myself. And the way it comes out in this EIF proposal, I think, is here, that you say, with patents, we are delivering innovations to people in proportion to their ability to pay. Those who can pay get the wonderful mRNA vaccine, and those who cannot pay, well, they're on their own. Here, in the alternative system, we are measuring impact, and impact is measured in a way that has absolutely nothing to do with whether you are rich or poor, whether you are handsome or not, whether you are well educated or not. Everybody's health counts exactly the same. And that, I think, is an important Kantian element in this proposal. I've already said that I'm adapting to TRIPS, and so the way I see the regime reform is we have one regime where the only way for innovators to get paid is patents, and then we have my alternative regime where there are two ways to get paid in the global south. In the north, you remain with patents. In the south, you have two tracks. So it's a relatively minor modification of a system that, it's not an ideal system, but it's a realistically attainable system where the new regime would be a two-track regime, two alternative tracks that are complementary to one another. And with regard to Coase's theorem, yes, I confess that what I'm saying is antithetical to that. And you can see that, right? On Coase's regime, you would say, look, if the people in the global south, or if anybody doesn't like the pollution, there's a very simple solution. Just go there, money in hand, and tell the coal-fired power plant that you give them more money than they earn for their electricity. And you pay them, and then they will do it. So the big problem with Coase's theorem is that, in principle, of course, it doesn't matter where the property rights lie. The one side can buy out the other, except that the one side may have no money. Right? And the people who in this world are suffering from pollution-caused harm are, for the most part, unsurprisingly poor people who simply don't have the money to pay off those who are soiling their air, their soil, and their water. So I think we agree totally. Yeah.
Thank you, Thomas. I now open the floor to the audience for a brief Q&A for questions. And Henrique, given the time constraints, we will limit it to 5 questions. Thomas will address the questions together at the end. Who would like to go first? Please state your name.
Eloy.
Como?
Eloy.
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 So my name is Eloy. First, thank you for the seminar. I think that everyone that studies environmental justice is a bit lost in regards of solutions. So when we have something as effective as you showed us, it's really hope. I'll just explain my question. I know that we have this big problem and it's not one solution that is going to solve everything. But when we have these few solutions as effective as the one you just presented us, we kind of wanted to solve a lot of problems. I don't know if it's clear. With the patents, there is more environmental damage, but there is also room for the countries that are underdeveloped to make their own greener solutions or more effective solutions. And when there is a fund, like the one you just presented, there is also, in my opinion, the perpetuation of the dominance of the North to the global South, because the money and the solutions are coming from the North. So I think that one of underlying, not issue, I don't know the better word, would be that there is this perpetuation of dominance. I understand that it's an alternative to the patent and also the pollution pool that you explained in your presentation, but as I said, that it's a bit unrealistic to wish that it will solve the whole problem, but I think that this dominance would be very present in this proposal. So if you could comment a bit on that, thank you.
Someone?
Professor POGGE, thank you and congratulations for your thought-provoking proposal, which is for sure a very relevant contribution to tackling maybe the most prominent problems of our time. One potential concern I'd like to raise is about the structure of incentives within the EIF. It seems that the risk-reward equation might feel unbalanced to many innovators. Scientific and technological innovation typically involves substantial upfront risk, with uncertain outcomes and long time horizons. And the current patent system at least promises a period of exclusive returns. In contrast, the EIF shifts rewards to the post-deployment stage, contingent on actual emission reductions in low-income regions, where uptake may be unpredictable and infrastructure weaker. How do you envision the EIF making that risk acceptable, especially for smaller or more mission-driven innovators who may not have the capital to wait for impact-based payments? what kind of guarantees, co-financing, or early stage support would make this model viable beyond large incumbents?
Thank you, Fábio. Now, Edivaldo? Ah, sim. Karen.
Thank you, Professor, for your lecture, and thank you also the professors for the very interesting debate. Actually, I have a question. Is very specific about the criteria that you consider about the green innovation to receive benefits for the fund, for the global fund. I didn't have the opportunity to read before the idea and the concept of the global fund, but I had some concerns about the two criteria that you exposed. First one is about considering the reducing of greenhouse gases and to promote health. Considering the first and only reducing greenhouse gas effects, are you considering also adaptation measures or only mitigation measures? Because in Global South, one of the most concerns today is about the adaptation agenda, not only the mitigation. So how we considered the technology or the green innovation in adaptation technologies? And the second question is about the considering of the environmental impacts. I didn't understand very well if you are considering the climate change impacts or the climate change risks, or if you are considering also the environmental impacts, considering as different impacts as the global impact, in climate change impacts. Dealing with the considering of the global risks and impacts, are you considering the life cycle of the product, considering also mining impacts, or considering impacts that are only environmental impacts and not only climate change impacts? In these criteria of alleging the green innovation technologies. These are the two questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And someone, no? Who? Tá ouvindo.
Live? Can you listen to me? Are you okay? Obrigado. Okay, I'm just stand up because you all listen to me. I have a very simple question. Thank you very much for your presentation, mentors. Eu tenho uma questão muito simples. I'm very interested in innovation in higher education. It's been a time and I'm dealing with that. Eu me interesso muito por inovação na educação superior. And I think innovation is one of the most difficult things that people have to deal with, because all the conservative movements, the dominance in the politics scene, who takes decisions. Innovation is very difficult to achieve, I think. Eu disse que inovação é algo muito difícil da gente adquirir, porque geralmente o movimento é o contrário, é para manter aquilo que a gente tem. And Professor Posa, this is my very simple question. E essa é uma questão muito simples. How people engage in innovation? As I think I agree with you. We need innovation to fight global change in climate. The very damaging that's happening everywhere. Eu disse. Então isso está acontecendo em todos os lugares. Esses danos estão acontecendo em todos os lugares. E nós precisamos de inovação. So my question is, how people get involved in innovation? The people you want to talk to, the people in the very basis of society. Because I agree with you. I think people in the basis of society, they need to take part, they need to take a role in innovation, and not only the very high level of technology. Because what we see in Brazil, and you talked about Brazil, eu disse para o professor, o que você viu no Brasil, você falou do Brasil, you see very simple people with sometimes a very low level of education, making innovations in their daily lives. But how do you transform that in another level? How do you make it a resource to the whole society? What do you think about it? You are a philosopher, so that's why I'm asking you that. Thank you. Eu disse, então eu estou falando de inovação, porque eu sou um filósofo, e o senhor também pensa sobre essas questões. Então, por isso eu fiz essa pergunta. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Lucia. And now someone tell us your name.
First of all, I think I should thank you to be one of the researchers from the North Global and been thinking about the health environments in Brazil and in the world. But when I see you talking and what you present for us, it looked like you were looking for a way to treat the trouble, but giving the responsibility for the South Global, and don't looking like the troubles on infrastructure. Infrastructure, thank you. And don't look into the infrastructure in the global, in the South Global, and don't thinking about how it can be a tough mission to us leading here. So maybe it's looking to a place like we have a big problem. Those problems it's not made by you, but you should to lead with it. You should to handle that, you know? So I don't think that the way that we can treat that is to giving those responsibilities to the countries that the poor countries. Maybe we should look into the other side. I don't know if I'm too. I don't know. I'm too overthinking about it, but it looks stranger when we look to those proposals that look like we made the problem, but you have to lead. You have to treat that. You know.
Thank you. Now it's not possible with 5. Yes, thank you. Professor, the floor is yours.
So let me start with the last question. I'm not giving the responsibility to the poor countries. I am saying that the Ecological Impact Fund should be funded by the rich countries, and it should incentivize more effort to clean up the environment in the global south. So, for example, you get rewarded only for health effects in the global south. Only if you improve the health of people living in the global south do you make any money. So in that sense, this is helping the global south overcome very significant burdens and vulnerabilities, right? The greatest ecological problems arise in the global south for a number of reasons. One is that the environmental standards are much lower. There's much less of a impediment to pollution. So look at Nigeria, for example, and the incredible pollution that the oil companies have left there. Ecuador is another example closer to Brazil. And also look at the heat problems, right? How many people die of heat stroke. The problem is not of my making. The problem is here in the global south. It needs to be solved in the global south. And I'm saying that here's a mechanism that would help solve it. And I demand, as I think you would, that those who are overwhelmingly responsible for causing that problem should be overwhelmingly contributing to its solution. Now, does this, the first question from Eloy, does that perpetuate the dominance of the North? In some ways, yes. I mean, it's true that the North is better able to innovate because they have this enormous capital advantage, right? The average incomes in the North are 5, 10, 20 times higher often than in the global South. Education is very much better. Research facilities are much better. People have time to think about innovative ideas and so on and so forth. That is true, and the Ecological Impact Fund is not designed to remedy that. The Ecological Impact Fund is designed to brutally efficiently achieve ecological benefits or to reduce ecological harms. So it's not, it's basically, its official doctrine is to say, we don't care whether you are southerner or northerner, if your innovation works, you get paid. But having said that, I also want to say that in regard to the innovations that the Ecological Impact Fund would support financially, in regard to those innovations, Southern innovators compete at less of a disadvantage than they now do under the patent system. So again, this was the example of the windmill, right? If you want to achieve an innovation that is useful for the global north or for the whole world, then very likely you will not be competitive, you will not be successful against the competition from the global north. The Chinese, the Germans, the Japanese, the US. But if you are inventing something that is useful for poor populations in the global south, you may well be competitive. You may well be able to think up something, and this was also goes to your question about how does one attract innovative talent in the global south. Right? Southerners have a much better chance to compete in regard to those innovations. And so I would think that adding this new innovation push into the existing regime would balance out things a little bit. But I admit, of course, that the imbalance would remain even within the Ecological Impact Fund. The majority of that money would, at least in the beginning, go to northern innovators, even though they are a minority globally speaking. Now, the question about risk, and it's true that it is risky. That is true also under the patent system. You run risks. It's unpredictable. Will your innovation succeed? Will maybe somebody else have an innovation that's very similar to yours, maybe even beat you to the patent office? The risks are always there, but it is true that the risks are greater in the developing world because it is just difficult to market and spread in innovation there. And here I have two things that may be helpful. One is that we should, in designing and implementing the Ecological Impact Fund, we should not merely appeal to northern states and say, you have to give us the money to run this, but we should also appeal to southern states and say, you have to achieve a more hospitable environment for these innovations to spread. You have to make it easier for the innovators. So one idea here is Africa, you have 54 states that are, each has their own regulatory regime. They often don't talk to one another and so on. And it can be very, very difficult to get permissions and licenses to market your product in all these 54 states. So if they had, through the African Union, if they had some sort of a unified system where if, let's say, one single office that looks at whether your innovation is safe and can be marketed in all of Africa, that would be enormously helpful in making it easier for innovators to spread their new green technology in Africa. So these would be examples how we can make it easier for innovators. The other thing is that if there are, or once there are, a whole bunch of innovators who are eager to spread their green technologies in the global south, then also specialized agents may emerge who will help with it, who will say, look, we are familiar, we are Africans, we are familiar with Africa, or whatever the country may be, or the region may be, and we can help you overcome regulatory barriers. We can help you find the right intermediaries that can bring your innovation to end users and so on. So the kind of infrastructure that is now admittedly missing would be incentivized into existence in part by the new money that the Ecological Impact Fund would unleash. So still, you know, I do want the Ecological Impact Fund to keep to that idea of success real, tangible end results. We will never pay money for any milestones, anything in between, any prototypes. We pay for real, measurable reduction of emissions and reductions of health burdens. I would like to preserve that principle, even at the cost of maybe deterring some innovators who may think it's just too hard to do that. Do we also include adaptation? Yes, of course. I mean, we include everything that has an impact either on the emission of greenhouse gas emissions or on health. And with regard to health, it is most obvious, right, that adaptation counts. If you have an adaptive tool that will leave certain emissions and pollutions in place, but will shield people from them in some way, so that they have better health, then yes, that is also rewardable. That counts as a green innovation as well. I think that is all that.
Thank you, Professor.
Hit with.
Thank you very much. We now have to bring this wonderful meeting to a close. I'd like to thank the audience and the commentators, and especially once again Professor Thomas POGGE for his contribution to address one of the most pressing issues in our global society. We are also grateful for him for presenting and discussing with us a stimulating and thoughtful project designed to address this problem in a reasonable and impactful way. With that, this session is now closed. Thank you very much.